Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the True Life Podcast. I hope everybody's having a beautiful day. I hope the sun is shining. I hope the birds are singing. I hope the wind is at your back. I have with me today, ladies and gentlemen, the modern trauma toolkit. I got some tools for you. I have an incredible individual. So today's guest is a visionary at the intersection of healing, equity, and systems change. Dr. Christine Gibson is a family physician and trauma therapist based in Calgary, Canada, whose work transcends borders, both literal and figurative. With a career steeped in global health, medical education, and equity advocacy, Christine has spent her life weaving narratives that bridge trauma, resilience, and the profound power of story. Her debut book, The Modern Trauma Toolkit, released in 2023, offers a revolutionary approach to understanding and overcoming trauma. But that's just the beginning. Known to her massive following as TikTok Trauma Doc, she's a social media powerhouse with over 130,000 followers, using her platform to educate, empower, and inspire global audiences. Christine's academic credentials are just as remarkable. Holding a doctorate in professional studies, a master's in medical education, and 2 TEDx talks under her belt, she's also a WHO-approved social media educator, a global nonprofit leader, and the force behind Safer Spaces training, a corporation dedicated to building psychological safety. And let's not forget the Belong Foundation, another testament to her tireless work creating spaces for healing and growth. Get ready to explore how trauma becomes growth, how systems can evolve, and how the power of storytelling might just save us all. Christine, thank you so much for being here today. How are you?
I'm great. I'm sorry, the bio is way too long. I should trim that to like 20%. But yeah, on paper, I'm fancy. And yes, I'm very dedicated to systems change and post-traumatic growth.
Well, I've got a few questions that are kind of stacking up here, and we'll bounce around a little bit. We'll get to the book, we'll get to the narratives, we'll get to the personal story. But let me just start off with this first question right here that's coming in to us from Desiree. She says, "What happens when the story?" Okay, she says, "You describe trauma as a story that our body holds on to. What happens when the story evolves faster than the body can adapt? Can healing ever outpace the pain?" Nice question, Desiree. Thank you for
Yeah,
starting us off.
it's a beautifully phrased question
Yeah.
too. Um, I don't think of any of this as linear. I think of this as really, really circular, and that way you can like in circles, you can also accommodate for ancestral trauma that we hold and the pre-verbal trauma that we hold and what we will pass on. And the circles also accommodate for like it's not just our body, it's our family system, it's the community, it's the ecosystem. So there's many circles that hold the trauma. So if it's getting beyond our body, perhaps the family circle or the community circle or even the ecosystem needs to hold it. So I try not to think of these things in really finite systems, but that there's all of these circles of healing and trauma that are happening. And I mean, I can think of a very specific example where that what you're describing can happen, and that's in our First Nations. So in Indigenous communities, I think the trauma did get beyond what could be held by an individual. And so it had to be held by a system. And sometimes it has to be held by the earth. And sometimes it has to be held in ritual and ceremony. That's one community where I think it did get and still continues to be quite overwhelming with the ongoing structural violence they face.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about. I love the idea of, well, I get the image of the stone being thrown in the still pond and the way it ripples out when I hear you begin to talk about the circular, the echoes of trauma on some level. It is like that though, right? Like a lot of the traumas people hold might not even be their own traumas. They might be their mom's traumas or their dad's traumas or their grandfather's traumas. Like that's kind of an interesting concept. Is that something when people come to you or you begin talking or maybe your own personal experience, that doesn't, you don't learn that right off the bat though, right? Isn't it sort of struggling with yourself before you start realizing, hey, this thing's not mine?
Um, it's one of the reasons when I work with trauma, I very rarely start with the story because sometimes the story isn't the story. So for two reasons, um, it can be very um, triggering, and it can actually strengthen the pathways toward traumatic memory and traumatic content to tell your story when you're not in a calm body. So the first goal is to learn how to be in a calm nervous system. And if I say, "Hey, tell me your trauma story," the first time that I meet somebody, we haven't established trust, and
Right.
we haven't established a path forward. And oftentimes they will be telling that story and strengthening the pathway. So it's one of the reasons why I don't start with that story, unless, I mean, some people will come to me and they have to tell the story. There's like, they're compelled to, and I will always listen to it. But if I'm making a suggestion of where to start, I start with the body and the nervous system, and I start with noticing. Can we notice if you're overactivated or underactivated? And that's where the trauma is stuck, in the nervous system. And once they learn how to get into the window of tolerance and into a calm body more of the time, that's when we start to approach what the story might look like. And sometimes the story isn't necessarily, "This is a thing that happened to me." It's more, "This is a feeling that's stuck." So if shame
Mm.
is stuck, if anger is stuck, one of the things that we just know is that might not belong to you. And it's one of the ways that I really enjoy working with both cognitive or brain based therapies and somatic or body based therapies, because those kinds of patterns that are inherited through our genes, they're often more amenable to somatic or nonverbal ways of moving them through. And yeah, I'll stop there. But I don't think enough people recognize this.
Wow. Yeah, we should back up a little because there's a lot of information in there. Maybe we could jump back a little bit to the beginning, and we could talk about what was it that, obviously, you have been helping a lot of people and you've done some really deep thinking to develop some tools like the window of tolerance and all of these ideas that are probably very helpful to people. But how did you get there? Did you start off maybe figuring out some stuff about yourself, or was there did you notice a pattern of people coming to you? Or maybe we could, this is probably the foundation of the book as well, but maybe we could talk about that a little bit before we jump back forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So um, I have been a family physician for over 20 years, and I started in a hospital system. So very, very ill patients, a lot of uh, pain and suffering. And it was a really intense job for me. So when I look back on it in retrospect, it was a fairly traumatic job. I would work 100 hours a week. I would be sleep deprived for a couple of days in a row. And seeing and being a part of the story of a lot of suffering without really an invitation to process it. Because as physicians, you're just told, like, if something bad happens, and this human that you are connected to, you just go to the next room. And so one of the things that I learned, I mean, extra, is to stuff my own feelings and to not really acknowledge them and process them. And a lot of us are like that, especially of a certain age. So, I mean, I find that the younger folks are less liable to do that than folks of my generation. And we just push down our feelings and trundle on. So that was my kind of first career path. And then I went into family practice in about 2017. And it was right after I had survived the earthquakes in Nepal. So I'd gone through significant personal trauma in the lead up to me leaving the hospital. And part of that was just this acknowledgement that I'm feeling overwhelmed. And part of that overwhelm was personal. There was a marriage that ended quite badly, and then there was the earthquakes. And so in Nepal, for those who don't know that are listening, there was a series of earthquakes starting with a 7.8 that rippled through the Kathmandu Valley where I'd been working at the time. And it was um, it was terrifying. I really thought I would die. A lot of the buildings around me came down because I was in the old city in Patan. And I didn't really understand what was happening in my mind body system afterwards. Like, I could kind of, with curiosity, think, well, is this PTSD? What's happening? But in terms of like really understanding it, I just had to do some research. So I obviously met with a psychiatrist. I got evacuated to Singapore, and he said, what you're having is a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. And I hadn't really heard that phrase before.
Yeah,
So
me neither.
I started studying. And when you just said the window of tolerance is a new tool, it's not. That's psychiatrist Dan Siegel. He came up with that. So a lot of what I did in the modern trauma toolkit is I brought together a lot of the thinking that's been happening by a number of different thought leaders in trauma. And I'm trying to explain to people in a really easily accessible way. So the book is written at a grade 8 language, and the examples are very inclusive, and they might be softly triggering, but I'm not going to describe events in great detail, which a lot of other trauma authors have done. So what I tried to do is I wrote the book that I knew my patients needed to read. And as I started studying trauma for like 8 years, I um I started focusing on it in my practice. So in my family practice, I put a lot of my patients through trauma therapies as I was learning them. And they didn't just recover in their mental health conditions, their physical health improved. And that was what really drove it home to me is if your nervous system is always in fight or flight or sympathetic state, your immune system never has a chance to turn on, or your rest and digest, your sleeping, your digestion, all of these systems are never really in balance. And the way that my patients recovered in my family practice was just so clear to me. They were back in an embodied state. Their parasympathetic state was starting to work. Things like diabetes and asthma and all these other things were improving. And I thought, wow, trauma is the root of so much of what I'm seeing. And my family practice was in an equity deserving community. They'd been through lots of childhood trauma and lots of systemic issues that happened to them. So now I work primarily at a refugee clinic and in adult addictions, and I still see a very small number of my old family practice patients. So it's really narrowed my focus in terms of seeing, well, who is the most harmed by trauma and not really accessing the help that they need. And then I keep thinking, well, how can we help trauma at these larger systems? We're facing climate emergency and natural disasters. We're facing political polarization. We're facing an ongoing pandemic, and people are struggling. And that's why I joined TikTok, and it's why I wrote the Modern Trauma Toolkit.
It's such a great answer. It's interesting to me that here you are in the stage of your life, if we take it to the beginning part of the story, and there's all these earthquakes around you. It sounds like a metaphor for your life on some level. Like all the walls just come crashing down, and you're like, okay,
Yeah.
here we go. That's crazy to
I
think
said
about,
that
right?
like it shook up more than my physical body. Like it shook
Yeah.
me up.
Yeah. You think there's a connection to something bigger? Like we spoke just briefly about like the concentric circles and how like the world around us is holding all this energy. Is it all necessary? Like, you know what I mean by that? Like, I know you didn't cause that earthquake, but on some level, was that earthquake a way for you to begin anew, to start a new life? Like, do you think that there's something bigger happening?
And before I answer, I want to acknowledge
Yes.
that at minimum 10,000 people died in that earthquake. Many of them in the
Right.
Kathmandu Valley. So it was a devastating earthquake for Nepal, and the repercussions are still rippling out as you described. That the
Yes.
ripples in the pond are still definitely happening in Nepal. So I was fortunate to survive, and many others didn't. Um, I mean, I had the privilege at the time of bringing a lot of awareness to what was happening in the earthquake because for whatever reason, I maintained my Wi-Fi connection. So I think part of my purpose in that moment was to bring attention to Canadians and even the world because I was one of few people who were able to tell the story through my lens, obviously, and just say what I was seeing on the ground. So like at that micro level, I think at that moment there was something that I had a purpose in that event. And it led to my first TED Talk is just seeing community come together and solve their own problems. For me professionally, those ripples definitely continued. And I felt like something that really opened up for me was this connection to flow. And I
Mm,
know when I'm supposed to be going in a direction. And every once in a while, I've got a confused, like right now, I was trying to decide about a program that I was studying in, do I stay or go? Because the flow wasn't really telling me what direction to go. But I have found that since being in the earthquake in 2015, a friend of mine sent me the TED Talk from Dr. Alyssa Rankin. She's become a good friend since then, but she was one of my first teachers in terms of like understanding whole health systems. And so that all happened in 2015 within like a week of itself. And then the kinds of therapies that I've been studying since, and I mean, I've certified in the alphabet soup of therapy. And that's why I called the modern trauma toolkit, because there's just so many tools in there. But I just find that the things that I'm meant to learn are just showing up in my path. And things like TikTok and the book, it's just come in a real flow state. And so I'm both learning and sharing and bridging and bending and all of these really interesting things that were definitely not on my path before the earthquake.
What led you to go to Nepal? Like that seems like there's a lot. It seems to me, I've never been there, but it seems to me the Eastern influence holds a lot of potential for Western medicine. Was there something that drew you over there?
I've been doing medical education work overseas since about 2007. So I started working in Laos through a project between Calgary and Laos, and
Hmm.
I was learning a lot through that program. But what it really stimulated me to understand is family medicine is the backbone of healthcare, and if they don't have strong primary care, health systems really struggle. So that was a lesson I learned in Laos. So I started a nonprofit called the Global Family Med Foundation. And so I've been doing academic consulting in places like Myanmar, so like Yangon, Ethiopia, throughout East Africa. So Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda. And I had spent about a month to 6 weeks every year in Laos as a part of that project for 8 years. And then I did the same in Nepal. So I would actually live on the ground for 4 to 6 weeks. Um, the hospital job did allow me to do that. That was one of the amazing perks of the crazy hours I worked, is I could just get a huge chunk of time off and live somewhere else. And I mean, when I say that I do academic consulting, so much of it was learning from the locals. And Patton Academy in Nepal has one of the most incredible community-based medical training that I've ever seen. They have all of their students from the year one doing 25% of their training in community, and that includes the rural communities. And I've never seen a program just so community oriented as what they're doing in Patton. And what they're allowing for is all of their medical students are comfortable and kind of craving these smaller community village environments where they're really immersed and connected to the people. And in so many other countries, the doctors are like, well, where can I work with, the fanciest machines and the highest tech and all the subspecialists? But in Nepal, they're like, where can I be in community? And it was amazing. So yeah, I learned a lot in Nepal. And I was definitely drawn to learning in resource poor environments, and then taking that knowledge back to Canada, where I was doing a lot of medical education, and I was running a residency in health equity at the time. Um, Nepal in particular, I was drawn to Patton, but I'd been to Nepal before, and I live in a mountain community in Canada. The Nepali, I mean, there's definitely prairies in Nepal as
Yeah.
well, but the mountains are really draw me, and the way that you have to put so much effort into being in community in Nepal, because these villages are so hard to reach. And just seeing how this medical education program was sending students out to these very far um, villages, and thereby helping them during the earthquake. I mean, there was one village where the medical students were stationed, and after their own housing collapsed during the earthquake, they spent the entire like rest of Saturday afternoon and night dragging the patients out of the hospital that was crumbling, and they saved all of them before the hospital fell. So, the stories that I hear are so um, I don't like to use the word resilient, because resilience is so often imposed on people, but it really is the story of resilience. And I've been totally honored to hear it in many different venues.
Thank you for sharing that. It It hits me on a lot of levels. My wife and her family are 100% Laotian, and so I get up to hear all these cool stories of Lao, and the families come over and we talk about all these amazing time. One of my uncles on my wife's side, we were talking a couple weekends ago, and he was telling me like how grateful and how thankful he is to be here. He goes, George, there's one question that I asked myself in Lao and one question that I asked myself here that are exactly the same but have a different meaning. And I go,
Mm.
what is it? And he goes, what are we going to eat today? In Lao, you ask yourself, what are we going to eat today? Because there's no food where we were at. And here I'm like, what are we going to eat today? We want to get some steak. We want to get some chicken. You know what I mean? Like he just said it with this gregarious smile, and you could feel the warmth radiating off of him. And I was like, whoa, that is a real foundation of community right there. When you're dealing with different daily expectations of how life is and what life means, and there is something real about community there when you're in a tight-knit community where everyone on some level has shared goals and shared sacrifices. You're not worried about buying a Tesla or going to Costco. There's bigger problems, and there's more important problems and more human problems on some level. It's
More
a
foundational problems.
foundation.
And I do think like the trauma in Lao, I didn't recognize it at the time because my radar wasn't really on it, but the most unexploded ordinances or
Yep.
landmines in the world
Yep.
exist in Lao. And I heard that story often because to this day, children will be walking through a minefield and have an explosion. And um, so one of the things that I saw in Lao that I've never seen anywhere else was just a lot of amputations and harm, and it's ongoing because even though the Americans dropped everything, they did not come and clean it up. So they called it the secret war because they dropped more mines into Lao than they did Vietnam during that time. So that is a trauma that lives on in the mulberry trees. Like the silk industry was like the backbone of a lot of Lao agriculture, and they had mulberry farms, but because so much chemical agents were dropped in the country, they lost 2 or 3 generations of mulberry trees because they couldn't grow, and then they lost the ability to weave silk because they lost the generations that knew how to do it. So one of the things that I saw that was connected actually to a maternity waiting home where women that were pregnant were waiting in a larger center so that they could deliver their child safely, and they were teaching these women how to weave. So, like, when you talk about those circles, like there were these circles of traumatic events that happened that wove through the generations. And you can also see the healing and what I would call post traumatic growth weaving back in. And I didn't have the words for it then, but when I look back on my experiences in Lao, that was very much what I was seeing too.
Hmm. Are there some particular areas of the book that are connected to that particular part of your life?
I didn't get really personal about it in the
Right.
Modern Trauma Toolkit, but I've traveled to, I mean, at this point, I think it's closer to 80 countries. It was about 60
Wow.
in the book. Now it's closer to 80. So I'm very much interested in both what did our ancestors know? Like what did my Ukrainian and
Yep.
Scottish ancestors know about healing that we have forgotten and we could accommodate into the healing paradigm? And what do other cultures do for healing? Because in Western culture, we're so quick to turn to medications. And
Totally.
I'm of the personal belief that medications don't do a lot for trauma. What they do is they mask symptoms. So I could give you a medication called prazosin, and it's a blood pressure medication, and it's going to lower your blood pressure, and it's going to change your dreams to be more calm because you no longer think that your body is activated. But all I'm doing is lowering your blood pressure at nighttime. I'm not changing the neural pathways in your mind. Whereas other cultures, they have community ritual like dancing in a circle or
Yep.
chanting together. And now I understand the physiology about why chanting works and why doing it in a group works even better because you're lengthening your exhale, which is your parasympathetic system. The
Yep.
chanting is vibrating your vagus nerve, which runs between your lungs and your spine, and you co-regulate in a group, and you actually, your mirror neurons will activate and group processes. This is something that one of the journalists that I quoted calls the extended mind. The extended mind is deeply healing, and we have so many cultural um, patterns that have been with humans for millennia, and in modern times we've lost them. So one of the things that I do explore in the modern trauma toolkit is, what did we know through ancient ways and what do we know through other cultures? I've studied Ayurvedic counseling, so that's the Vedic texts in India, and 10,000-year-old knowledge. I've studied Qigong with a guy out of Minnesota, actually. Spring Forest Qigong is how to take the healing practices and make them really easy and simple. He calls it, Master Lin calls it, a healer in every home. So I'm really interested in how these ancient techniques can be relearned. And I think we need to do that because we don't have a pill for what's happening to us right now.
We don't have a pill, but we have some mushrooms. Like, I've been
That's
working a lot and they're readily available. I'm not a doctor. I'm not saying people should do them, but I spend a lot of time in the community, like PTSD, trauma, addiction, speaking to people that are sort of on the front lines. And I can't help but hear the similar ideas about the body keeps the score, the 4 agreements, neuroplasticity, the default mode network, all of these ways in which modern medicine through SSRIs seem to be a way to, just dampen everything down so you can white knuckle it through another day and be happy about it on some strange level. But when I start hearing again about rites of passage, ceremony, all of these wonderful ways that we have sort of turned away from, like, man, it gives me goosebumps to hear, because I can't help but see this thing percolating to the top. Like, hey, here we are. We all need some help. What if we did it in a community? You know what I mean? Like, I think your book is just like is just another concentric circle radiating outward and helping people see that. Like, is this bubbling to the front right now? Are you seeing that as well?
Yeah, and I mean, you've brought up so many things in that uh, one paragraph, George. So I'll grab a
Yeah, please.
couple of the threads that you've just woven. Um, so one is psychedelics. I mean, when I have this chapter on chemicals in the modern trauma toolkit, and I'm talking about drugs, I don't really differentiate between heroin and cocaine and the folks that I see at the addiction clinic are using,
Yep.
because in the 1940s, doctors were freely prescribing and taking these substances because that was considered medicine at the time. So, concentric circles, like opium was one of the reasons that colonization happened, and colonization has caused most of our trauma if we look at systems. So like I think all of these drugs and chemicals are just so connected, and if you look at the lineage of cultures that have had a relationship with plants, so you mentioned psilocybin or
Yes.
mushrooms, but I mean there's San Pedro, there's ayahuasca, and a lot of what we use now as plant medicine has derivations in the natural world,
Yep.
and there's communities that have a long lineage to it. So I do worry that we're kind of commodifying and we're
Sure.
turning like psychedelics into uh, our capitalistic structures. We're kind of adding them to
Yeah.
colonized ways. And I think it's really interesting to explore, well, what does that lineage look like? And what does a relationship look like?
What's
Um,
it?
I think psychedelics have a lot of potential in our relationship to trauma and traumatic events, but in such a cautious way, in a very humble way, and to acknowledge people with that relationship and try to be in relationship in that way. Very curious, very humble, and in a very careful way, because set and setting matters so much. And so even at the addiction clinic, I've got some folks who are addicted to um, the psychedelic category of medications, and it's not supposed to be. Like if you look at the
Yeah.
drugs of harm, alcohol and tobacco do far more harm than psychedelics. It is so wild to me that they keep restricting the use of something that the research is showing is so deeply healing, but it's healing in a very specific environment. So when I talk about it in the modern trauma toolkit, I'm really specific about set and setting. So set is your frame of mind, and setting is who is around you, who is guiding this journey. I don't think people should just go into a cabin with some a heroic dose of psilocybin and try to work out trauma. That can go horribly wrong.
Yeah, without a doubt. It's interesting to see. I can't underscore enough the idea that whatever you take is sort of a bridge. Like, you still have to confront the shame. You have to confront those threshold guardians of shame and guilt that are standing there. Like, you can't go in over here. Like that's part of and maybe that's the part for the ceremony. Maybe that's the part for the chanting. Maybe that's the part to see the elders passing down wisdom so that you as a younger person can say, hey, here's this tool. And now you're old enough to use it. You've seen these things. Now I'm going to show you you've experienced them. Now I'm going to show you how to integrate them. Like, it kind of seems like we're talking about integration in a lot of ways.
Absolutely. That's well said, George. And I think, like in the book, I outline these 3 stages, and they're again not linear. Like I think of them as circular and like kind of spiraling up and spiraling down. But Judith Herman describes establishing safety, remembrance and mourning, and reconnecting. And so to me, that's noticing what's happening in the system, what's happening in the nervous system, what's happening in the family and the community system. And so that's establishing safety is getting into a place where you can actually be in a calm body and move to phase 2, which is trauma processing. So I call that shifting. And a lot of that is through neuroplasticity, which you mentioned. In the modern trauma toolkit, I focus more on phase 1. Like, what are the different ways that you can learn to shift your own nervous system and to shift the community system towards a place where process work can happen? Process work is a new relationship with the past, and that can be your personal past, but it can also be the ancestral past. And the simplest way to describe it is just leaving the pain of the past in the past, and post-traumatic growth is moving forward in a way where you've let go that strong connection to the pain. And a lot of people identify with it. They believe that the story of trauma is their story. And that's one place where I feel like the trauma gets really stuck. But for a lot of other people, they're very curious about what else is possible outside of those trauma reflexes. And that's where we get into phase 3, which is reconnecting to self, your adult consciousness, reconnecting to community. And that can be pets and nature and music and art and spirituality and all these other ways that humans can connect. And we've lost that priority. And these are ancient things that we've been doing for millennia, and we forget because we become cogs in the wheel.
Yeah, I think it reminds us that the rituals are there for a reason. Like, when you talk about getting stuck in the story, for me, that looks like a negative feedback loop in an internal dialogue. You are a dummy, George. Why did you do that? It's unforgivable. And it's like, it's real easy to put that record on and just let it play. You know what I mean? Like, it's almost like, okay, stop. I'm done. I don't want to hear this anymore. This is a stupid record. I don't want to hear it anymore. But it's hard to, like, it plays in the background. If you're not aware of it, if you don't physically take the needle off and set it down and be like, I'm scratching this record up, I don't want to play that anymore. You know what I mean? It'll play in the background, right?
That's what I call noticing, is like noticing what that record is, and noticing it without shame, like without like looking at it with the lens of curiosity and compassion. I always say I always wear glasses, and one of the lenses is curiosity and one of the lenses is compassion. And instead of saying, well, why do I have this story? What's wrong with me? And I hate this story. Say, why does the story make sense? Like, what is this story telling me? And when you ask, why does the story make sense? Then you're exploring it with a great deal of curiosity. And many times it will trace back to childhood. Sometimes it will trace to the ancestors. And when you understand why the story makes sense and why the story is protective. So why would it make sense that I think I'm not good enough and I'm not deserving? Well, when I was a child and I wasn't getting my needs met, it was safer for me to believe that there was something fundamentally wrong with me than believing that my caregivers weren't capable of getting my needs met. That is life-threatening. Whereas the belief that I'm no good is ego-threatening. And that was actually easier to handle. If you can look at that story with adult consciousness, that's when the healing takes place, because you recognize that the story was always there to protect you. It was not trying to hurt you. And you can develop a better relationship with that story. And when you recognize that that story is there for a reason, and that story makes sense, then instead of recognizing, oh, there's that story again, and adding to the burden of shame, you say, oh, I wonder how I can help the part of me that's stuck in that story. And it becomes so much more a story of grace and healing and growth rather than continuing to get stuck in the shame.
I feel like I'm doing some therapy right now. Thank you for that.
Well, I mean, that's my goal, George, and that this is what I do on TikTok, is I try to give 1-minute snippets of like, what if you thought about it this way, and how would that feel different? And I learned so much from my patients and in community, and I'm constantly learning. So, there are beautifully accessible ways for us to see things differently.
Yeah. And they're right there waiting for us. It's almost sometimes I was talking with a friend of mine yesterday, and we were talking about insights and discovery. And he said something new to me that's like, discovering isn't having this flash of insight like a light bulb. It's more of discovering, like you're taking things off so that you
Mhm.
can notice them. And I was like, for me, that hit home. And I'm like, oh, that's how I was able to discover this thing, or that's how I discovered this thing about myself. And it helped me to think about it in a way that was much more meaningful and helpful and allow for further discoveries. It's like, oh, I'm just taking these things off. That's all I'm doing. I'm just discovering this. And here I am. I'm kind of awesome in this way. And maybe that's a cool thing. And it's interesting to think about the linguistics of it.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of the therapies that I use actually, are really embedded in wordplay. And what I've come to understand is the language of our subconscious mind is not English. The language of our subconscious is story. So it's imagery and it's metaphor.
Yeah.
So using interactive guided imagery where you don't just tell the story of where to be. Like I won't say like, let's go to the beach and I'm going to tell you what it's like. I'm going to say, would it be a safe place to imagine that we're going to a beach? Would you want to have shoes on? How close would you want to get to the water? And the person guides their own imagery. And then they guide themselves to a place of calm and connection. So I love using imagery and I love using wordplay. So one of my favorite phase 2 trauma processing therapies is called accelerated resolution therapy. And it's a cousin of EMDR. It's like a more gentle and faster version. And the creator, Lainey Rosenzweig, she put so much wordplay into it. So she'll say things like, you have some change in your pocket and you're going to give this change to try to get the brain ready for change.
Wow.
Or she uses like a movie metaphor where you're watching this movie and the movie is changing, and then you're the director of the movie and you're changing what's happening in the movie. And so much of what you're doing is shifting through metaphor and wordplay. Like if I'll just give you an example of somebody I saw this week,
Yeah.
and we did an ART session, and they were feeling very constrained and constricted. And so we imagined what it would take to break that sense of constriction. And sometimes people will break a rope or lift a weight, or they use power tools, or somebody like a spiritual guide will help them with that. But there are these metaphorical ways of breaking this heaviness or this tightness that we have in the tissues that aren't available through saying, well, I'm going to think my way out of it. So I just love the creativity that can happen in phase 2 trauma therapy. And like I can't teach you how to do your own DIY accelerated resolution therapy in my book, but I can certainly teach you how to get there. And the use of metaphor and wordplay is one of the things that I love working with. So in the Modern Trauma Toolkit, I have 40 different activities. Many of them are audio guided practices. Some of them are community level exercises because within those concentric circles, healing doesn't just happen in the individual. So I really wanted to share all of these things that I was learning.
Yeah, I'm glad that you did. This sounds amazing to me. And I can't help but think how in a book like the Modern Trauma Toolkit, combined with the spoken word that you're able to do on the different channels that you have, it's almost like healing can be contagious the same way that illness can be contagious, right? Like if you're radiating that outward, like why can it be? Like why can't wellness be as contagious as illness? Wait, isn't there like that great quote that says the difference between wellness and illness is I, something like that? Is the I?
Yeah, all of that's really beautiful. Yeah, I do believe that healing happens in different levels. So sometimes one person can work through traumatic patterns of attachment,
Yeah.
um, wounds, or things that they were exposed to in their family unit, and they can heal the unit for the generation. So if
Mm.
one person is doing the work for the family, then the next generation will have healed those pains. And that can happen at the molecular level through something we know is called epigenetics. So just as trauma can be passed down through multiple generations, so can healing. So there is that kind of linear progression through a family, but there is also community healing. So one of the things that I witnessed in Nepal after the earthquake was community looking after each other. There would be a giant tarp with many families that were newly unhoused, and then they would have this giant bowl of dal bhat, like the lentils and the rice, and they were cooking for 50. And so community did look after each other, and they knew that they weren't going to be alone on the street the way that we often are in Western culture, that the community would take them in and look after them. And that's what I saw. So we live in the Western society. Many of us live in very individually focused lifestyles. And what I think we really need to discover or uncover is that we're like humans are meant to live in community. We're meant to live in a much
Yeah.
more collective way. And I think one of the many lessons I learned by working overseas is just what it looks like to live in more of a collective unit. And I think it's one of the ways that colonialism and capitalism paradigms have harmed us. And I'm not saying it hasn't given us great tools. I mean,
Nope.
modern medicine is awesome. I love to use modern medicine tools as well, but I don't want to forget the things that we've always known.
See, that sounds spiritual to me. And I don't mean like religious. I think there's a difference between religion and spirituality, but
Yeah.
there is something so powerful about realizing that you're bigger than yourself and you're part of this huge thing that's trying to communicate to you on some level. And you could see it like when you go outside and you see this flower bloom and you start thinking, man, it's August 24th at 2:22 p.m. How did it know? How did it know to climb that high on that tree and produce that flower? Right. How did it know? And you can't help but think that the same divine intelligence that knew that also knows where I'm at in life. Maybe that's the
Mm.
reason I'm here right now. And you start realizing, wait a minute, I'm part of this thing. Maybe I didn't come into this. Well, maybe I came out of it. And then like that, then you start really having some discovering moments. Right? Isn't it? Is it spiritual? Is there some spirituality going on here?
Yeah. And I don't want to impose that
Right.
perspective on everybody, but like, yeah, I totally see what you mean. And I think Eastern philosophy, like you asked, like, was I,
Yes.
connected to Nepal? I mean, I've studied Ayurvedic counseling. I have been a practitioner of yoga for like decades. Um, I do believe that there is some Eastern philosophy that has a lot more understanding of interconnectivity than we do. And it's why we keep trying to appropriate things like mindfulness and reinvent it. But I mean, this has been around forever. So one of the things that I've explored working in the East is meditation and mindfulness and the tenets of Buddhism. And I think it is very interesting how healing can come through this sense of interconnectivity. One of the things that I do, so I teach my patients something called tapping, and
Mhm.
tapping is self acupressure. So acupuncture is when you take the meridian lines of energy in the body and you insert these needles. You can tap those same lines. So you use your fingertips. And what EFT tapping did is they map the emotional meridians of the body. Could I explain that in a Western context? A little bit. We're actually starting to get some research to understand how self acupressure works. And we've got great research proving that it works for things like trauma and anxiety and cravings. Um, when I do tapping with my patients and I'll teach them self acupressure, and there's a whole book, chapter in the Modern Trauma Toolkit, as well as a 20-minute video teaching anybody who is interested how to do tapping. I will say to them, when you set up the phrase that you're going to use for your session, don't say, I have anxiety or I am anxious, because then you become that thing. Say, there is anxiety because you
Mm.
have some and I have some, and your neighbor has some and your child has some. There is anxiety. This is a part of the human experience. This is something that our brain does. And so there is anxiety allows you to connect to this very human experience that we all have. And you said the definition between like wellness and illness. And I was just reading for something that I'm writing on Substack about the WHO's definition of well-being. And I'm studying lifestyle medicine right now. So they had it in the curriculum, and it was kind of this like positive thoughts and an absence of negative emotions. And I was like, an absence of negative emotions? That's not the human journey. Like the opposite of trauma isn't being happy all the time. It's flexibility. And that's what I'm constantly teaching my patients is like, of course you're going to be sad or anxious or experience guilt, like we all do. This is the human experience. We just don't want your day-to-day life to be tilted in that direction. Flexibility allows you to experience the whole gamut of emotions. And when we have this like sense of interconnectivity, we realize that is the human journey and all of us are on it. And that's what it looks like when we're connected to everybody who's on that same journey. And that means the non-living world as well, and all of the living beings and these greater ecosystems, because like we are a carbon-based life form with a whole lot of water in us. So for us to not have the humility to understand that the carbon and the water around us is also inside us, like the interconnectivity is just deep at every level.
Yeah, it's ineffable in so many ways when you really begin thinking about it, but so profound in its ability to inspire, maybe even hurt on some level. Like in that, it makes me think about like empathy and trauma and vulnerability, in that we're drawn to the dark side sometimes, whether it's watching someone go through a traumatic event or ourselves being stuck on a traumatic event. But isn't that so helpful to other people that may have gone through it or maybe getting ready to go through it, is to see an example of that trauma and to see how someone goes through it, not like in a like a masochistic way, but like I think we're so drawn to it because it is the answer in so many levels. Like seeing that trauma in a way is prepping you for an experience you're going to have. And once you've gone through something, like maybe you've lost a child, maybe you've seen people that on their take their last breath, or maybe you've been in a car accident, you've seen a suicide. If you've been through that, then don't you also become a way to help other people go through it? Like, isn't that trauma something that once held long enough can become a tool to help other people?
It's a really good question, George, and I'm torn on the answer
Okay.
because I think that the last word in the last sentence that spoke to me is can.
Hmm.
Like going through trauma or witnessing trauma can lead to post-traumatic growth and insights, but it can also get stuck. And I think a lot of our problems in modernity, why we won't let go of um, consumption, even though it's like we've overconsumed the planet and we're worsening inequity and we've caused this like climate catastrophe, but we're so addicted to these ways. And I think it is traumatic. Like I think we're digesting our trauma through consumption and through distraction. And one of the reasons why we have such like split and dangerous politics right now is I believe trauma responses. It's coming from fear and anxiety and a sense of not being safe. And so I think trauma can compound and worsen if it's not acknowledged and processed, and if we're not looking at it with that higher consciousness and seeing the greater whole. So um, we can have traumatic experiences through witnessing. And I think one of the reasons why trauma is so much more held in the collective body is because we're witnessing things that we never would have been able to see 40 or 50 years ago because of social media, because of
Yeah.
the immediacy of it. Like the things that I see about war. I took in 3 Ukrainians that were evacuating 3 years ago. Um, and the things that they would continue to see even while they were here was so deeply traumatic and still is to this
Yeah.
day. Sorry, I get a bit emotional about that. But
It's
one
okay.
of them lived with me for 2 years, and I'm just very connected to her and what she still continues to witness, even though she's not physically there, although she's going back next week. So
Mm.
there's these connections of what we witness that really hurt us. And witnessing can cause trauma, and I don't think enough people recognize that. So if you've witnessed something traumatic, you need to go through those 3 stages of noticing, like, how is it affecting me? And what is my nervous system feeling? Am I overactive or am I underactive and numb? And
Mm.
how can I process this thing that I've witnessed and integrate it into um, this journey that I'm on, and then potentially get to the point where I can help others and reconnect. But not everyone goes on that journey, and I think trauma is stuck in our current modern system, and it's why I use the word modern in the modern trauma toolkit, is because I do believe a lot of the patterns that we're seeing are as a result of stuck trauma. So I think there is the potential for post-traumatic growth and helping others through it, and I believe that that's a large part of my personal journey. But there is the potential that that's not what happens, and that we can get stuck in trauma responses and trauma loops. And I do think a lot of that is happening in modern times.
Yeah, it's well said. It's interesting to, so many people get absorbed in the doom scrolling, whether it's seeing images come from Ukraine or Gaza or South Sahara Africa, wherever in your own community, and like you see
Yeah.
these things and it's like, let me just move past that. And it's so big. The trauma collectively is so big that no one person can hold it, but we're all taking a little piece of it in. And sometimes I wonder, like, there's that great quote that says the only way out is through. Is the way out potentially each individual doing their very best to solve that little slice that they have, to make their life a little bit better, to make their relationships a little better? Is that how we move into a world that's, better by factors?
Yeah, absolutely. And that is what gives me meaning right now,
Yeah.
is there is this possibility that if we as individuals and families and communities work through the trauma that not just that we've been exposed to or witnessed, but that we've been complicit in.
Yeah.
Like when I think about, like, I'm studying climate psychology right now, and I think a lot of the solution to climate psychology is decolonization. And I know that that's a word that's really triggering for folks, but what it means to me is getting back to our indigenous ways of knowing. And I don't mean we just like live in huts and live off the land the way, all of our, background indigenous ancestors would have lived. But I mean, like, in relationship to that
Mm.
interconnectivity. And that's indigenous to all of us, is to be in relationship to water, to be in relationship to animals, to be in relationship in community, instead of this like hyper individualistic focused um, way. And I do think that that possibility is emergent. Like, if I look at what's happening right now, could we come out on the other side with this like collective awareness and this like just knowledge that we really are in this together, and a rising tide lifts all boats, um, rather than thinking like, there was this beautiful phrase that just happened in the New Zealand Parliament because the Maori people are fighting
Yeah.
for their treaty rights right now. And somebody, and I don't even know where the quote comes from, but like, when you've been so accustomed to privilege, the equity feels like oppression. And I think that that's driving a lot of folks in Western society, is they're afraid that we could all be okay. And what I want to share through my social media and the Modern Trauma Toolkit is like, no, 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 no. We all can be okay. And to not be afraid of that possibility.
Yeah, it's this idea of like winner take all, whether it's colonialization or maybe it's maybe we're drowning in abstraction. You know what I mean by that? Like, you ever think like what might it be like to tell somebody who lives in a third world country or ask them if they have health insurance or life insurance? Like, what is this life insurance you speak of? Wait, so what is this thing? Like, we have
Yeah.
such abstract ideas, especially financially, when you start talking about derivatives but that gets us that I think that's a direct line to colonialization, is just finding wordplay to make people not afraid of death. Maybe that's what it is. Maybe we're all afraid of
Yeah,
death.
no, you're taking this in a really cool direction. Yeah, I mean, I've got all kinds of random thoughts about the financial system too. Like, once we removed the gold standard, it just became numbers on a page. Like, it's
Yeah.
fanciful, it's playful,
Magic.
and yet there are so many people for whom those numbers on the page don't add up to rent, and that's worsening.
Yes.
Like
Yeah.
the unhoused communities are just. I have so many folks that I work with, both at the refugee and the addictions clinic, that are just one paycheck or very small amount of money from being unhoused right now. And I these numbers on a page that are we've assigned meaning to are harming so many people right
Yep.
now. And there's got to be a way out. And the way out is not let's kick all the immigrants out,
Yeah.
because it's we're complicit. Like, the reason why a lot of people are escaping war or drought is because of the systems we've created. And we actually need to stop the systems in order to stop this migration. And I don't have all the answers, but I love
Yeah.
that we're talking about these bigger systems, because it is the systems that are harming. It's not just the family. It's the family that's facing poverty and scarcity and suffering. And so much of it is connected to these policies that I'm just really curious how we can shift policies towards post-traumatic growth and equity and interconnected awareness. Um, and New Zealand has that opportunity now, and we'll just see what happens.
Yeah. I almost feel like it's part of the cosmic joke of like, there's some bigger force. It's like, I am just going to rub your nose in absurdity until you figure this out. Like, I used to live, I spent a lot of time in Hawaii as a UPS driver, and I would drive down to like Waikiki, and like, there's all these high rises, and they're building high rises like faster than you can shake a stick at them. And I remember going in and talking to the people. I'm like, dude, who's buying these? And he's like, I don't know. And I'm like, are there local people buying them? He's like, definitely not local people, man. There's no local people buying these places. Each place is $1 million, and it's like a 32-foot skyscraper with, and it's like, I don't understand it. And I started talking to another guy, and he's like, he's like, here, let me tell you, let me help you out, George. These are just like really cool tools for really wealthy people. They're gonna buy like a financial place will buy 50 of them, and they'll just sit on them, and maybe they'll Airbnb them, but they'll probably just sit on them, and then they'll sell them later because they're going to go up in value. And it's like, then I go downstairs after I deliver a package, and there's like 35 homeless people outside. And I'm like, there's no one even living in these places. There's no one living in them. And there's all these people out here that are just, knocking on the door of like, of disillusionment, that are suffering on a level that I can feel walking past them, and I'm like, it's absurd. It's truly
Yeah.
absurd to think about where we're at on that level. But I think the idea of community is what brings us back to that. The modern trauma toolkit, these ideas about stuff. I'm sorry, I kind of go off on tangents sometimes, Christine, but I can't help it. It's so crazy.
No, I feel the same way. I mean, I ran a residency program, like a fellowship in health equity, because I really want to understand how these equity
Yeah.
deserving communities have been placed at so much risk, and it seems to be getting worse.
Yeah.
I mean, not everywhere. Like, if I look at Northern Europe, they actually have quite a lot of, like, a large social net and a large social structure where they make sure that nobody gets left behind. But in this like individual paradigm, like, with so deeply embedded in, like, well, if you're not a functional human in capitalism, then what's your value? Like, how did we lose sight that beings had value? Like, just as my dog has value and a bird has value, a human has value. And we shouldn't be having throwaway humans. Like, this idea that I mean, there's just so many racist things around it too, but like the idea that there's anybody who's lesser is just really sad. And the fact that we've allowed society to express that belief, and I think it comes from fear. It comes from this fear that, like, there's not enough to go around, and there is, and there always has been.
Yeah. Yeah. It's mind blowing to me. We got another question coming in here. It says, you've worked in systems change in global health. Is the healthcare system more traumatized than the patients it serves? How can the system itself be healed? That's an awesome question.
That's such a good question. I wish I knew some more answers to it, but I know that there's some really smart people working on it.
Right.
Not where I live. Right where I live, they're decimating the healthcare system. But um, I I'm really intrigued by a few movements. So I'm studying lifestyle medicine right now, which
Okay.
actually has some really good research showing that the pillars of sleep, nutrition, which is a more plant-based lifestyle, movement, so exercise and moving your body, and it doesn't have to look like being a runner, but just moving your body for 150 minutes a week. Um, Social connection, so maintaining your connections, avoiding risky substances, so like tobacco, but I mean, alcohol is growing exponentially, marijuana is growing exponentially. There is a huge opioid crisis right now. Um, and like stress level, like managing your stress level. So these pillars of lifestyle medicine are things that we always knew were connected to health, but like a lot of physicians didn't focus on them. So I've been really intrigued in studying like how can we get back to basics? And what's amazing is because this has become like an accredited board certification, there's tons of research coming out and a lot of the pillars of lifestyle medicine are equally effective, if not more so, than the medications that I've been prescribing for 20 years. So I really think that um, like getting back to these foundational things that we all could look after. And if we were to focus on things like sleep and stress, we would change all the systems because our work system and our schooling system and the political system, it's not helping us with sleep and stress. And like the fact that agricultural lobbyists and pharmaceuticals have so much say in government policy, we have to totally decouple that if we're going to get healthy from a systems perspective. So, I mean, I talk about community level interventions you can do. I
Yeah.
teach people in the book how to do a social innovation lab. So one of the things that I loved to study was design thinking and how can we as a group get really creative in solving our own problems. And I'll actually give you the roadmap on how to do that,
Yeah.
like from an iceberg model of system thinking to how can you actually work as a group to solve complex problems. That is a chapter in the modern trauma toolkit because I do think we have to work in community to solve these complex things. But the people who have the power to change these bigger systems at this political level and policy level and the way that industry has somehow become more important than human needs. I mean, we just need a massive culture shift for that to happen. And to me, the climate emergency is the signal that's going to make people finally realize like, if we don't make a change, none of us will survive this or survive it in a way that's going to maintain comfort. And that should be very distressing to people. And I think that might be the signal that will finally start to shift things. That's what I'm hopeful about. But I mean, we've got power, like we do have representation, and we can vote and we can try to influence policies in lots of different ways. So I think of the different leverage points that I have access to. And, you know, I joined the city climate advisory council. Like, how could I influence different regional decisions? We all have that capacity. And once we've healed our trauma, we will then have the bandwidth to
Yeah.
contribute at these system levels. And that's why I want people to really work on how can I get into a calm body and start to use my thinking brain again? Because when you're really their trauma reflexes get stuck, your thinking brain is not as accessible to you. So only once you're got a better balance between your overactive and underactive nervous systems can you even access those cognitive structures again. So it's stepwise.
It makes so much sense when you start looking at, it, for me, like I had a lot of trauma in my life and I spent a lot of time, and so did my family, living paycheck to paycheck. Like you
Yeah.
can't get to the next level when you are constantly in a state of fight or flight like that. You are just surviving. You're just surviving. And it's like you said, if you come from a family, if you come from the habit of just surviving, it's really difficult to become an activist in a way that is meaningful for your life or for your own life or for your family's life. It breaks my heart to see it on so many levels. But the only way, like no one's going to do it for you. Like no one will. Like you have to find a way to take that first baby step, whether it's getting up and moving, whether it's saying, you know what, looking in the mirror and being like, you know what, I feel pretty good today. pretty good looking guy over there. I'm a pretty good looking girl. Whatever it is, getting in the mirror and playing, or having that just one few positive words that start that snowball down the hill. But you build momentum, right? Like once you begin taking those steps, you build momentum, and that change becomes from an idea translated into reality. You have to have some amazing success stories of people that you've seen make profound changes. Can you share one of those with us?
I won't share the details just because I have to
Okay. Yep.
de-identify folks. But yeah, I mean, it's countless, countless, countless success stories. But success is kind of knowing what your values are and being able to live according to your priorities. And that looks different for every person, right? So I can't say like success is like, oh, they became this like business person, because like it all has to do with your own values. Success to me is when you're able to work towards the things that you value. And I've seen so much of that, but I've also seen a lot of people who were so locked into trauma loops that they weren't really looking after their mind body system. So I mentioned that I moved further from family practice and more towards focusing on trauma because it seemed to be the root of a lot of things. So I've seen some people whose diabetic control was just horrifyingly bad and they were at risk of like blindness and kidney failure because their diabetes was so terrible. And then we did trauma work, and all of a sudden they were able to be in their body again and they had diabetic control again. So they were able to say, I care about me. And before they weren't even really able to believe that they deserved care. So I can see like physical transformations, social transformations, people who um, are reconnecting in a new way within families. They've learned enough uh, self-care that they can be boundaried. So lots of healing just looks really different. So the way that I describe it to people, and I have an illustration in the Modern Trauma Toolkit, but it's the difference between resilience and post-traumatic growth is like resilience is when you're back to your baseline. So you're floating along, trauma pulls you underwater, and resilience is like you've got flotation devices and you're keeping your head above water. And like you mentioned, you're surviving, but you're not thriving. And post-traumatic growth is when you learn how to swim. And that's what I'm trying to impart to everybody through like socials and the book is like, what does it look like to learn the skills to swim? And it's not to say that trauma isn't going to happen again. There's going to be another wave coming. But once you're not floating, you're actually going to learn how to swim through it in a different way. And I mean, I'm on that journey too. I'm trying to figure what this looks like because, we've talked about a few traumatic events that I've gone through, but I mean, medicine is inherently traumatic. I'm constantly experiencing vicarious stories of suffering and hearing and witnessing this. How do I integrate that? What is my meaning? What are my values? I'm still trying to figure that out. And it's not being happy all the time. Like I said, it's flexibility.
Yeah.
Some days you're sad and that's the way things are. And some days you're overjoyed. And I think when you can be more present, and this is what we learn through Eastern cultures, is like a lot of trauma lives in the past, and being much more present is when you let it go and you're aware like that happened to me, but that's not happening to me right now. Or if it is, I can envision a future. So you mentioned kind of looking in your mirror and giving yourself affirmations. One
Yeah.
of the techniques that I teach in the book and kind of went viral on socials is affirmations. And you just say a phrase that's hopeful and you stick the words what if in front of it. What if things will work out for me? What if I actually could imagine a future where I feel like I deserve good things? What if uh, I'm going to find a friend? Like these just positive, hopeful constructs. Because our brains, once we've been through traumas, we're just so drawn to the pain. Like we're used to that pathway. It's familiar, even though it's not comfortable. And we just need to make new pathways familiar, ones that are more comfortable. And affirmations kind of plant these little seeds of possibility. And all it is just planting new seeds, because a traumatized brain is constantly planting seeds of what's familiar. And planting new seeds will grow your neural garden in new ways. And we're all capable of doing that.
Do you think on some level, it almost seems like our system is set up to enforce trauma? Like we take I remember when I dropped my kid off at like preschool for the first time. Maybe this is just like too far out there, but I'm like, oh, what am I doing? I'm a horrible father. I'm doing this, and I'm gonna go work at this place I don't even like to be at, and then my wife's work, I don't get to see her. Like it's so it just reinforces that on some level, and then you start looking at some of the north, like you had mentioned, like the northern Scandinavia countries or northern Europe, and like they keep their kids at home until they're like 8 before they even send them to school. And you're like, they seem pretty happy over there. Are there some things in our system? And you start thinking about maybe the Prussian school model and why we had to have everybody go to work and all these things like. And then maybe on a hopeful note, you're beginning to see change with like the book that comes out and doctors like yourself going on and able to give people free of charge these tools that can help them change their life. Do you think maybe our entire system is evolving in a way that is evolving out of trauma?
I want to believe that, George.
Me too.
That's what keeps me going. Like, and there's two things. Like, I think a
Okay.
lot of it is frame of mind. So when you drop your kid off at preschool and they're crying, part of the information would be like, what if they have the most amazing day? What if they meet their best friend today?
It's true.
What if this is the beginning to like a whole new way of their brain working? How exciting for them.
Yeah.
Can we always reframe work in that way? Maybe, but sometimes it just feels like you're gaslighting yourself.
Yeah.
Have a great day at work. Just cognitive. But what if I could be more present in the moment? And like, what if instead of feeling frazzled as a doctor, is I really look into someone's eyes and I give them like really sustained attention and a sense of connection. And I don't necessarily know if I can do that with every person in a day. Like they actually did studies
Yeah.
out of Harvard showing that for physicians, we can only really deeply connect to about 30% of our patients in a day. And not everyone needs that every day. But on the day that you need it, I want to be able to give that to you. As a trauma therapist, I have to aim closer to 100, and it is a little bit more tiring. But one of the things that is a possibility is that I can find more moments that are aligned with my values and notice them and amplify them. So our brain actually amplifies the negative. It's designed to do that because we have so many parts of our brain that's designed to protect us from threat and danger. So it amplifies dangerous signals, whether it's inside the body, like pain, or outside the body, like bad things that are happening. We actually have to deliberately practice to amplify the good. And it's a lot of what I teach in the Modern Trauma Toolkit is how can you amplify these different signals that are also available. So that's the Eastern philosophy of being present in the moment and like being really attuned to nature. So like when I walk my
Yeah.
dog, one of the things that I really deliberately do is I will notice something, whether it's a flower or a tree or a cloud in the sky, and I will notice something in the natural world and allow myself to connect to it. So I'm not like, just listening to a podcast and not even paying attention to my dog and his experience of the world. Because, oh my gosh, that's fun when you really get into it. So yeah, a lot of it is what we amplify.
Yeah. It does bring me lots of hope and joy to think about on some way we are the narrator of our own story. If you look at yourself like living in a novel in some way, you're able to be like, okay, I'm the main character. How do I want this character arc to go? Or what do I want to accomplish? Or is this a
Yeah.
threshold guardian over here? Or, okay, let's have some fun. Let's try to get the author's attention over here. It's kind of fun to think about that aspect of it.
I love that language, George, because I've been writing fiction for like 15 years, and I had actually finished this book once, but it wasn't quite good enough to publish. So when I was offered a nonfiction book deal, and my agent kind of helped me refocus, and we ended up getting a great relationship with my publisher, I thought, I need to just focus on the nonfiction for a bit. But I'm back to writing fiction, and I'm working with all these different workshops, learning this. Like, how do I tell a story that's universal? How do I tell a story that's surprising? How do I tell a story that I actually want to tell about the world and its potential? So I'm writing cli-fi. So that's eco-fiction. And it's basically putting it into the future that's not apocalyptic, but climate change has resulted in some changes. And I'm trying to speculate, like, what would it look like? And I got really stuck because my novel has to do with my Ukrainian ancestors.
Mm.
And because of what's happening in Ukraine right now, I got so stuck. And then I thought, well, I get to write the ending that I want. So, I mean, I won't spoil the whole thing with my book,
Yeah.
but um, Ukraine does really well in the end. And they, because so many of their systems have been devastated, they've had to start reimagining systems that are suitable for modern times. And what they reimagined saves us all is my book. So like that's the system level of my book. And there's like a beautiful protagonist and everything. And like, how do I want the main character to overcome this like really significant trauma, and what kinds of realizations do I want her to have? Well, it has to do with interconnectivity and community, and it has to do with hope, and it has to do with relationship with the human and non-human world. And how do I tell that story in a way that's not like preachy? I'm figuring that out, but it's really fun.
Are you sure you're not writing a biography? It sounds beautiful. Maybe just look at it from that aspect. You know what I mean? Like,
That's so awesome. Yeah, not really, but I mean, anyone who writes fiction, there's parts of you that get infused into it. My grandmother definitely shows up in the book. uh, she it was so amazing because I had her tell the stories of like
right?
our ancestors, and so I have these micro cassettes, and then I have some on my iPhone, and like I always have her story. And I think one of the things that we lose sight of is it's all about story. Like indigenous ways of teaching each other have always been storytelling. And so we can tell ourselves a different story about who we are and our relationship to the world, and we can heal through story. Like we can teach a new story to the next generation instead of the story of separateness and the story of pain. And I think that's what it's all about. And you're working on that, and I'm working on that. And there's a lot of us working on that. I think everyone really is. And that's their intention. And that's my hope that we'll move towards it.
In Hawaii, I got to talk to some really cool people, and one thing that the state poet told me was that we're all ancestors in training. And
Mm.
when you told me that brief part about how you are able to listen to the words of your grandmother on like a micro cassette, I can't help but see the same way that people in indigenous tribes listen to the sound of the elders that may have passed away. You know what I mean? It's still like it's so similar in so many ways. Like you're pulling from the past in order to create the future. And like in some ways, that's the essence of a metaphor, right? Like you're taking something from the old and giving a new meaning. But that's the only way, whether it's in linguistics, whether it's in ceremony, is that we have to pull from the past in order to create the future. And it seems odd that way. Why are you going to make anything different? Well, you just change like the dog bit Johnny versus Johnny bit the dog. Two radically different things that happen there, but you just change the position of them, and you can come up with incredible things that happen on some level. It's mesmerizing. I can't wait to check out your Cli-Fi book. This sounds awesome.
Well, I mean, hopefully it sees the light of day. I'm really reworking it this year. But I also I think writing is really
Yeah, of
healing for me. So when I
course.
think like look at the news of Ukraine and like my ongoing connection to the country, and it's really easy to feel hopeless and full of fear. And so I wanted to learn like what would a new narrative look like that has hope and humility and curiosity and compassion and all these things that I'm trying to embody in a new way. And I mean, it's concentric, right? I'm on this journey and it's the spiral, and some days it works out better than others. Um, I I really do believe that um, there's so many of us that are consciously on this journey right now. You're bringing so much awareness in your podcast. There's a lot of us that are trying to amplify the work of healing and a new story. So I have to believe the new story is possible and that we're writing it together.
Yeah, I agree. It's emerging as we speak, and there's the hero next door. That's what I think. When I look at my neighbors, I'm like, look what they're doing. That's so cool, you know. And like when we can begin to see that hero next door, I think we give ourselves permission to see the hero within, on some level.
Mhm.
Might as well just reference Joseph Campbell and say we're all on the hero's journey on some level.
Super interesting because I started studying the heroine's journey. And
Okay.
the hero's journey, he goes to the village and he conquers the obstacles and many obstacles. and then comes back to the village with the elixir. And it is actually a little bit of an individual story, but the
True.
heroine's journey is the story of the collective. And what the heroine encounters is this understanding is that community is the answer, and she does not have the elixir alone. So that's what I'm examining in my book. So, and I don't think it's gendered. I think it's
Yeah.
more just that what we've ascribed to masculine values have been the individualistic values. But I mean, every human is capable of being more collectivist and community minded. So yeah, I'm curious about what that journey looks like.
Well, I think it's playing out. Like if you look at the sort of I don't want to call them heroes, but I will say the role models that are thrust upon society. They have been this sort of front man for a community that no one talks about. Like every star, every person that is up there, whether it's a maybe not every, the majority of people that appear to be a superstar have a giant community behind them that make them who they are. And they're the face of this community, but the community doesn't get noticed. It's just this person out front, like, look at me, I'm insane. Oh, how great I am. Well, you have been the product of all of these people building a life around you. So you are awesome, but you're awesome because of these people. They should get more recognition. But that's dying. If you look at maybe in the Western world, like you see it crumbling. And maybe what's crumbling in the Western world are these ideas of individualism. You know, some people mourn that, like, oh no, the individual is dying. But look what happens when that front person steps down. You get to see the people that built it. And like that, I see that happening, you know, whether it's the modern media crashing or different presidents that make different promises and never deliver, you know, like you're beginning to see the community rise up in ascension with them fixing their trauma, you know, and like we're all worthy of living a better life and becoming the very best version of ourselves and living our ideas of a community. And I don't know. I think that the book you put out and what you're saying and what you're doing on your social media is a giant boon to community. And I think that that's where we're going to find the answers for those of us that don't have them, is in the people that are working and figuring it out on some level. Thank you for doing it.
Well, and again, the ideas aren't mine. Like, just as you said, it
Right.
takes this community. So when you said
Yes.
you created these ideas, I'm like, well, no, I mentioned the work of Judith Herman and her 3
Yeah.
stages of healing
Yes.
and the window of tolerance from Dan Siegel and all of the people who've created the somatic techniques. So I put the book together as like a primer
Right.
on where we're at right now in our understanding of trauma and toxic stress. And with lots of tools that I've learned, did I creatively embellish some of them and add to the collective knowledge? Sure. But what I really wanted to acknowledge is like, these are the concepts that so many others have come up with, and I've gathered them for you in a way that's easy to read, inclusive examples, hopefully not very triggering, but that's my contribution. And did I maybe have some new ideas about social innovation and design thinking that nobody else has put in with trauma before? Maybe. So that's part of my contribution. But it was a community level contribution. And I really wanted to acknowledge just how many things I read. Like, I don't know how, if your viewers can like see, but I read hundreds of books to try to get this book written, and wanted to synthesize a lot of what was known already. So yeah, I think when I talk about like what our ancestors knew and what we've forgotten through that lineage, and when I think of how many people are already working on this, and even just in the TikTok community, like I met a woman named Simone Saunders who happens to live in the same city as me in Canada, who's doing tremendous work on socials as the cognitive corner. And now we are working together in the company, Safer Spaces Training. And I think about like all the work that she's doing and the ripples that she's created. It's wild. I mean, she's amazing. So I want to do this work in community too.
Well, I think you are. And I am grateful for this conversation. I hope we can have more of them. Like, this has been really, really fun. And I still have other questions that I wrote down, and I got one or two from the guests that are coming in here. But you've been very gracious with time, Christine. And
You
before
probably hear my dog losing it upstairs. He's not happy right now. So yeah, I should probably listen to him.
Really fun, Christine. I'm very thankful for all of your time. However, before you leave, would you be so kind as to help people understand where they can find you, what you have coming up, and what you're excited about?
Yeah, for sure. I'd love to. Thanks for the window, George. I appreciate it. So my book is called The Modern Trauma Toolkit, and the easiest way to find buying options is the website for the book, which is moderntrauma.com. I would love for you to explore the website because it gives you the tone of the book. It's really soft and nourishing. And so if the website vibes for you, it's probably going to feel pretty safe. Like on one of the pages of the website, I'll just drop this Easter egg. The cursor turns into a butterfly. Like this is the team
Yeah.
I worked with. They were just amazing humans. Um, my personal page is christinegibson.net, and that will link you to the other companies that I run, including Safer Spaces Training, which is psychological safety work, as well as me doing keynotes. I love speaking. So if you have a group of people that want me to speak, and there's a budget because I got to be boundaried as well. I love speaking to groups about this. And what I think companies are starting to recognize is just how much stress and emotional dysregulation are showing up in the workplace. So there's more and more conversations about this happening. And I love to be in conversations. So those are probably the easiest places to find me. My writing, Substack, everything is on the professional page.
I love it. Fantastic. Hang on briefly afterwards, but to everybody within the sound of my voice, please go down to the show notes. Do yourself a favor. Check out the new book by Christine Gibson. You don't have a copyright there that you can show anybody that might be watching, do you?
Yeah, of course. Like there was one, where is it? Right there on the shelf.
Okay.
But this is the bookmarked one where that I give readings. So I've got all the
Nice. Nice.
Yeah.
So everybody's seen a picture of it there. Go down, check it out. Reach out to Christine. I hope everybody within the sound of my voice has a beautiful day. There's a beautiful holiday coming up, and I hope you choose to have the courage to become the very best version of yourself because you deserve it, and the world will be better because of it. That's all we got, ladies and gentlemen. Aloha.